Good afternoon. Monday, March 6, 2023. A book I wrote, Old School versus New School Baseball Analysis. Which players had better stats and achievements? The old schoolers. I consider two baseball eras. 1871 through 1949, the first 75 years, the old school baseball era. 1950 to 2022, new school baseball era. I analyzed all the players in the Hall of Fame and their stats and accomplishments. My previous two videos, one was on batting average and one was on most hits. The batting average video, the old schoolers won. They were better at the batting average. In the most hits in a season, the old schoolers won that battle over the new schoolers. This video, runs scored. Who was better at scoring runs? The old school players or new school players? Let's look at the stats. From 1872 through 1879, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year period. The average run scored, 69 runs for those 8 years. Camp Hansen, Jim O'Rourke, some of the old schoolers scoring runs. The most there was Jim O'Rourke, 97 runs he scored. In the 1880s, 10 years, the average, 115 runs scored, was the tops in the league. If you take each year the person with the highest runs scored, and then you go year by year by year for 10 years, and then you average it all out, 115 runs. 1890s, well, in the 1880s, who was starring? King Kelly was very dominant, and Dan Brothers. 1890s, take the 10-year period. Well, in the 1880s, let me tell you, the high was King Kelly had 155 runs scored one year. Okay, 1890s. What's the average? 153 runs scored. The high that year, that decade, was Billy Hamilton, 198 runs scored. So take the 10 years, average it out, 153. 1900s. The average, 109. So it went down. From the 1890s to the 1900s, it goes down. What's the high that decade? Nap Lajoie, 145 was the high. Honus Wagner was in that decade. Ty Cobb comes on toward the end of the decade. 1910s through 1919. What's the average? 118 runs scored. The high that decade, Ty Cobb, 148. 1920s, what's the average? 153 runs scored. It goes up. In fact, that's the second, that ties for the highest in the decade, because the 1890s, 153. 1920s, 153 runs scored. The high that decade, Babe Ruth, 177. 1930s, what's the average? 147 runs scored. Who had the high in that decade? Lou Gehrig, 167 runs scored one year. 1940s. Oh, okay, well, the 1930s, what's the average? 147. 1940s, what's the average? For the runs scored, 105. It goes down because you had the war years. What's the high that decade? Ted Williams, Ted Williams, 150 runs scored. So recap the old schoolers. Runs scored, take a 10-year period, the high for each year, average it out. 1870s, 69. 1880s, 115. 1890s, 153. 1900s, 109. 1910s, 118. 1920, 153. 1930s, 147. And the 1940s, 105. So what's the aggregate of that 75-year period? What's the average number? 121 runs scored is the average. Let's look at the new schoolers. That's the period between 1950 and 2022. In the 50s, what's the average? 125. Yeah, and the high for that decade, who had it? Mickey Mantle, 132 runs scored. 1960s, the average, 120. The high for that decade, Frank Robinson, 134 runs scored. 1970s, the average, 122. Who had the high? Billy Williams, 137. 1980s, the average, 123. Who had the high? Rickey Henderson, 146 runs scored. 1990s, the average, 126 runs scored. Who had the high? Craig Biggio, 146. The 2000s, the average, 118. The high, Jeff Bagwell, 152 runs scored. And then the 2000, from 2010 through 2016, I'm going with Hall of Fame players. So you can't go all the way to the year 2022 because after 2016, you need a 5-year waiting period, right? So there's no Hall of Famers elected yet. So for 2010 to 2016, the average goes way down, 79. So what's the aggregate of that 75-year period from 1950 to 2022, which is 75 years? The aggregate is 116 runs scored. What was the aggregate on the old schoolers? 121. And for the new schoolers, 116. What does that tell me? It tells me that the old school baseball players in the first 75 years scored more runs and averaged more runs than the second 75-year period after 1950 through the present time. Old schoolers are better at new schoolers in scoring runs. Agree or disagree? So we've done 3 videos on old school versus new school. And batting average, I'll recap it for you. So I've got it here in this book I wrote. What was the aggregate? For batting average, 376 in the first 75 years. And the second 75 years, 340. So in the batting average, old school wins. How about hits? Most hits in a season. The aggregate for the first 75 years, 207 hits per season. For the new schoolers, 201. So the old school beat them in hits. And now I just did runs scored. The aggregate was 121 runs scored in the first 75 years. And the second 75 years, the aggregate is 116. Old school 3, new school 0 as far as comparison. And who wins? Who's next? Runs batted in. Who wins? Old school or new school? Stay tuned. I'm out.